Well, thank you, friends, for tuning into this installment of our midweek reflection here. And today I want to do something a little different, something that actually sort of breaks one of my own personal rules, which is not to speak in sort of one-way communication forums like this about sort of hot-button issues and things that are going on, because I really believe that these issues are best discussed, where there's some back and forth, and it's not just either me talking like this or a social media post here and there. But sometimes things go on in the world that I think really demand that Christian leaders comment and try to help encourage us to think and be Christianly in this. And by the way, I'm of course referring to what's been going on in the streets of our country this past week, and even in the streets of our town later today as I'm recording this, where people are protesting and demonstrating, in some places turning into riots. When things like this are happening, I think as a church we have to say something about that. But I will say too, and I know there's a long disclaimer here, that particularly for those of you who would disagree with my perspective, I'd love to really have an opportunity to listen more personally to you, either by a phone call, a screen, or preferably even face to face, so we could kind of talk together about this and learn from each other. Well, first of all, with the event that precipitated these protests, the killing of George Floyd, as a follower of Jesus Christ, the first place that I come out in this is I'm intensely sensitive about the abuse of power by people who are in authority. Jesus himself was killed because of a conglomeration of people in authority, both religious and civil, Romans who ensured that Jesus was crucified. Now, of course, that's the quintessential example of God bringing something supremely good out of something evil. Our salvation came out of Jesus' death. And yet, still, the people who perpetrated this, they were motivated by evil. They were people in authority who abused their power to see somebody killed. As I think about this with respect to George Floyd, then in the first instance, I'm not talking about any racial component whatsoever. I'm seeing him as a person who was killed by some people in authority who abused that authority in an egregious and a horrible way. And I would hope that all of us would be equally appalled had it been a Caucasian person or an Asian person or an Hispanic person, or even had it been, say, a Taliban member who was in custody of U.S. military, clearly under control, and being killed in that fashion. Because when somebody with legitimate authority does what was done to George Floyd, that is a horrible, despicable, egregious abuse of power. And the person that did that, and perhaps to a lesser degree, others who allowed that to happen, need to be held accountable. Secondly, as a follower of Jesus, though, I am even more appalled at racial prejudice than a secular person, because I deeply, deeply believe that every human being has been created in the image of God, that every human being is somebody for whom Jesus Christ died. And every human being, if they profess faith, if they embrace what Jesus has done for them, can become, a son or a daughter, an adopted son or daughter of God by their faith, no matter what their racial backgrounds. I don't believe that we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officer who put his knee on George Floyd's neck did so because George Floyd was black. That's why I began this by saying it's the abuse of power angle that first catches me about this. And really, unless a person actually declares themselves to be a racist, in specific instances or with specific institutions, it's very difficult, again, to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there's a racial component involved there. However, I have seen enough anecdotal evidence to believe that racism is alive and well in our nation and even in our community. And I say this on the basis of just many conversations and interactions with people over the years, and also on the basis of several very specific incidents that I've seen happen in the lives of my own non-white children, and contrast that with the experiences of my white children. And some of those experiences have even happened involving police officers or others with civil authority. And I'd be glad again to talk more specifically with you if you'd like. But I'll just here's one general thing that has some specific instance attached to it. I am 56 years old. I've been driving now for 40 years, and I drive a lot too. I really probably have driven almost literally 1 million miles in my life. And all that time, I have never once been pulled over by a law enforcement officer, except for when I deserved it. And in every instance except one, deserved it because I was exceeding the speed limit. I contrast that with my 20-year-old brown-skinned son, who has several times been pulled over for no specific violation. And then I think of a few other incidents with this same son where law enforcement has more discretionary power. They can either intervene or not, and where in his case they intervened, whereas my other white sons in very similar situations that they've been in many times have never experienced police intervention in those ways. And I think of some incidents not at all involving police officers, not involving authorities, where this son and his brown sister have experienced outright hostility from people who would shout at them and call them racial names, who would threaten them with bodily harm because of their race. Now, I must say that for these and for every other instance that I can think of here, that there have been months and sometimes years where all that my kids have experienced were positive and affirming interactions from people and from social institutions. And I always try to drive that home to my kids as well. That think of all the people and all the ways that you've been treated wonderfully. But nonetheless, when I seek to look at the world through their eyes, I can see that racism is alive and well in the United States and even in our community. And friends, as followers of Jesus Christ, that just simply stinks to high heaven. It really does. But by the way, I know that in many of these protest movements, there are plenty of secular people, even atheists, who are involved. But and it strikes me that atheists who aren't racists either, but at the end of the day, if you're an atheist, especially a materialist atheist, and you're not a racist, it's because, well, really nobody's life matters. It's because we're all just matter. We're all just a bunch of chemicals. But friends, I really don't believe that whatsoever. I believe we really are created in the image of God. And again, as followers of Jesus too, think about how Jesus treated Samaritans, how he treated the Gentiles, who in his day were considered racially different. Think about in the book of Acts, how the mission to the Gentiles that we're the heirs of. If it weren't for that mission, most of us, wouldn't have the gospel shown our way because we don't have a Jewish background. And just think of John 3:16. For God so loved the world. People of every conceivable background, viewpoint, culture, and race. And lastly, for me as a follower of Jesus Christ, I believe it is so important that we be able to demonstrate how one can be incredibly angry at injustice and evil, and yet not let that spill over to hatred. It strikes me that it's especially as followers of Jesus that we need to shine here, because I really don't believe that apart from being a follower of Jesus, that human beings have the resource to really be angry at injustice without it spilling over into hatred. How it doesn't just become it's us or it's them kind of affair. Those who study the civil rights movement of the 1960s will often note how with Dr. Martin Luther King, his outrage against racism did not spill over into hatred toward racists and toward institutions. And that's because for Dr. King and for his wing of that movement, he and they were deeply influenced by the gospel, by their sincere Christian convictions. And honestly, one of the really scary things to me about the protest movement in this day is that it's led in large part by secular people, particularly younger secular people who are just plain angry. And again, apart from the gospel, it is difficult, if not, and I believe it's impossible, for anger to not become hatred. We do, though, have some shining examples, though, in today's situation of Christian people expressing righteous indignation, and yet with a love and a mercy and a forgiveness of enemies that comes from their love for Jesus. I heard yesterday on the radio some audio from a march in Milwaukee where some African-American marchers were, and I'm sure at part of the march they were chanting various slogans, but at this point they were singing. They were singing Michael W. Smith's Waymaker. Waymaker, promise keeper, miracle worker, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. And when you deeply believe, when you really know that this is who God is, this is what gives you the wherewithal to really be angry at things that are wrong and things that are evil without coming to hate those who are caught up in those things. And I know for myself, any kind of involvement that I'll have in any of this protest type stuff, that's really what I want to convey. That's my motivation. My motivation for this is to be involved in ways that reflect something different, that reflect something that is good and that is godly in the midst of this evil situation, and being able to be angry at injustice without hating people. That to me is one of the hallmarks of Christian witness in this situation. Well, again, friends, thank you for listening to this, and again, if you'd like to speak with me further about this, I'd be really, really glad to listen. Thanks much, and God bless.